Hello, this is the sermon for the 11th Sunday after Pentecost, Sunday, August 9th, 2026, and the text preached on is Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Jesus walks on water in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John, but only in Matthew's Gospel does Peter get out of the boat to try and walk toward Jesus. In all three Gospels, the disciples go ahead of Jesus across the Sea of Galilee by boat. Matthew and Mark both say that Jesus stayed on the other side in order to go up a mountain to pray, while John's Gospel also says that Jesus went up a mountain not to pray, but in order to escape a crowd that wanted to make him king. In all three Gospels, Jesus walks across the sea after miraculously feeding at least 5,000 people. There is more that the stories of Jesus walking on water from these three Gospels have in common. In all three, the disciples encounter rough weather. John's Gospel simply says that the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Mark's Gospel says that the disciples were straining at the oars against an adverse wind. Matthew's Gospel says that the boat was battered by the waves, for the wind was against them. In both Matthew's and Mark's Gospels, the word describing the quality of the wind as adverse or against the disciples in the boat connotes opposition or hostility. That is, the wind is against them in the strongest way possible. It is depicted as actively hostile to the disciples. In Matthew's Gospel, the word used where it says that the boat was battered by the waves denotes torture, torment, or harassment. And Mark's Gospel uses that same word to describe how difficult it was when the disciples were straining at the oars. The storm afflicting the boat is a torment to it and its crew. In Matthew's and Mark's Gospels, in the story of the stilling of the storm, which happens before Jesus walks on water, it says that the storm was so bad that the disciples, when they go to wake Jesus, who is somehow sleeping through the storm, say that they are perishing. They are obviously afraid for their lives. But in the story of Jesus walking on water, it is not the storm that terrifies the disciples, but the appearance of Jesus as he walks on the water, a detail reported by all three Gospels in which the story of Jesus walking on water is found. In all three Gospels, Jesus encourages the disciples by saying, "It is I. Do not be afraid." But what Jesus actually says, where the translation reads, "It is I," is "I am," in Greek, ego eini. This is the same as the name God gives Moses in the story of the burning bush, when God says, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you." It is no accident that Jesus identifies himself in precisely this way. The story of Jesus walking on water, as it is told in each of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John, shares so many details in common. But as we saw, only in Matthew's Gospel does Peter get out of the boat and try to walk on water himself. Let's recall how the story goes after Jesus identifies himself. alluding to the divine name as he does. Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, Come. So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me! Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, You of little faith, why did you doubt? There are different ways of understanding Peter's request. It could be seen as Peter affirming Jesus' power to grant his request. After all, Peter does address Jesus as Lord. In Matthew's Gospel, a title frequently used by those who plead to Jesus for help or healing. Seen this way, Peter's request is a recognition that Jesus' walking on the water is an epiphany. That is, Peter is acknowledging the divine power at work in Jesus that lets him walk on the sea. But, seen another way, Peter is putting Jesus to the test. He is demanding a sign that will confirm Jesus' identity. In other words, Peter is joining the company of Satan, the high priest, and the mockers at the cross, who all put the same challenge to Jesus. Each of them says much the same thing. If you are the Son of God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Peter does not look good here if we consider his request in this way. Whichever way you look at it, Peter ends up faring poorly in our eyes, either because he is testing Jesus or simply because of his fear that causes him to sink, which in turn causes Jesus to ask him, You of little faith, why did you doubt? As a result of Peter's fearfulness and failure, his part of the story of Jesus walking on water in Matthew's Gospel is often used as an object lesson. One commentator calls the story a lesson on discipleship, a lesson for Jesus' followers on conquering adversity, fear, and doubt through the power of faith. The story shows that the problem is fear that betrays a lack of faith. Looking at the story as a lesson on discipleship, however, can be challenging in our situation, in which an increasingly fewer and fewer faithful Christians may fear that the decline of their churches is precisely due to a lack of faith. It is important to keep in mind that fear can indeed inhibit faith, as the story shows. But it can also be crippling to feel that if only we had more faith, our churches would be growing, when in reality, what is going on is that there are powerful forces acting across our entire society which are behind the decline of mainline Christianity in Canada, and no amount of faith can address those forces, at least not on a large scale. It seems that it has been common among preachers, perhaps because they are aware of the possible hitch in using the story of Peter's failure to walk on water as a lesson on discipleship, to take a more positive tone. They might stress, like a drumbeat, that what we have to learn from Peter is to keep your eyes on Jesus. Focus on the Lord. The worse your troubles, the more you need to look steadfastly to the one who can save. Don't be led to doubt and fear by circumstances. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Now, this might be good advice, but the problem with it is that it can never create what it demands. Being told we should keep our eyes on Jesus does not and cannot help us to do so. And the more we are told to do so, the less helpful the repeated advice becomes. Or, the story of Peter's attempt to walk on water might be turned into a morality tale. It can be seen as a story about overcoming the stress that comes from stepping out into new situations. This is possibly the most upbeat way of looking at the story. But the problem with this approach is that it can be platitudinous, turning the story into an ordinary self-help resource, when what a sermon is supposed to do is remind us of the good news of God's love for us through Jesus. Peter's importance is a feature of Matthew's Gospel. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah in all four Gospels, for instance, but only in Matthew's Gospel does Jesus reply by saying, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." But as important as Peter is to Matthew's Gospel, however, it seems that focusing on Peter in this story is not helpful. We need to find something or someone else to pay attention to. Let us look at the story of Jesus walking on water in Matthew's Gospel in this way. Suppose that the first evangelist includes the part about Peter trying to walk on water, not so much to emphasize Peter's importance as to emphasize Jesus' importance. That is, even if this part of the story appears to be about Peter, it is really about Jesus and who Jesus is. We have already seen something of what the story says about who Jesus is when Jesus uses the divine name to identify himself to the fearful disciples. I said earlier that Peter's request might show that he is acknowledging the divine power at work in Jesus that lets him walk on the sea. But it is not just that God's power is at work in Jesus at this moment. In the Old Testament, only God walks on the sea. In the midst of the sea's churning, Jesus does what only God can do. Along the same lines, when Jesus and Peter get into the boat, the wind ceased. Obviously, Peter has nothing to do with this. It is Jesus' doing. And once again, stilling the sea, like walking on water, is a manifestation of divine power. Only God stills a storm at sea. Twice, in just the one story, Jesus is shown doing something that in the Old Testament only God is said to be able to do. And just in case we are not up to snuff on recognizing allusions to the Old Testament, Matthew's Gospel explicitly says, "And those in the boat worshipped Jesus, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" Other than Satan, who uses the title Son of God in order to tempt Jesus, no one has recognized Jesus as the Son of God to this point in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel uses the story of Jesus walking on water to mark a key point in the disciples and in the reader's understanding of who Jesus is. But perhaps most important of all is that even though Jesus does chide Peter after rescuing him, the point is that Jesus rescues Peter. Peter cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. Jesus has been given divine power, and he has been given that power in order to save. Perhaps what we are meant to learn from the story of Jesus walking on water in Matthew's Gospel is not so much to keep our eyes on Jesus, but to always remember that Jesus is keeping his eyes on us, even you and me, and that he has been given power to save us. And not only that, but also that he has already saved us, because we have been baptized into Jesus' death and resurrection. We can be assured that we will share with Jesus the renewed and risen life in the kingdom of God.